Welcome to a deep dive
Okay.
into emancipation during the Civil War.
Wow.
Yeah. We're going to be exploring an episode of the American History Tellers podcast called Emancipation.
Okay.
And it really kind of reveals how enslaved Americans were far from passive bystanders.
Right.
They actively shaped the course of the war and ultimately their own freedom.
Yeah, that's what's so compelling about this episode is that it really does challenge kind of the traditional narrative by showing how enslaved people were really making strategic moves right from the very start of the war,
Yeah.
taking incredible risks to kind of seize their own liberation.
Yeah, it reminds us that even amidst unimaginable circumstances,
Right.
the human drive for freedom is a powerful force.
Absolutely.
And the episode opens with this incredible story
Okay.
about Robert Smalls,
Okay.
an enslaved man who was working as a pilot on a Confederate ship called the CSS Planter.
Right.
In 1862, he devised this audacious plan to essentially steal the ship
Wow.
and deliver it to the Union.
It was a gamble with incredibly high stakes. Yeah. I mean, Smalls not only had to navigate this heavily guarded harbor,
Right.
but he also had to convince the crew
Right.
of enslaved men to join him,
Yeah.
risking their lives for a chance at freedom.
And it's not just about the daring escape itself, but also Small's success really challenged the prevailing stereotypes about the intelligence and the capabilities
Exactly.
of enslaved people.
Yeah.
And that had a profound impact, I think, on the perception of the war
Absolutely.
and fueled the arguments of abolitionists
Right.
who were advocating for Black participation in the fight.
Absolutely. Small's story really underscores this kind of theme of agency
Yeah.
that runs throughout the episode.
Yeah.
Enslaved people were constantly looking for ways to undermine the Confederacy and contribute to the cause of their own liberation.
Another pivotal moment early in the war takes place at Fort Monroe in Virginia.
Okay.
3 enslaved men, Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, and James Townsend, escaped to the fort seeking refuge.
And their arrival created a real dilemma for Union General Benjamin Butler, who was in command of the fort.
Right.
A Confederate officer demanded their return under the Fugitive Slave Act,
Yeah.
but Butler was hesitant to comply.
So he comes up with this clever legal strategy declaring the men contraband of war.
Right.
His reasoning was that since they'd been forced to work on Confederate fortifications, they were essentially enemy property that could be seized.
This was a brilliant move
Yeah.
with far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
Not only did it prevent the men from being returned to slavery, but it also established this legal precedent that would shape the course of the war.
Wow.
The term contraband quickly became synonymous with escaped slaves seeking refuge within Union lines, forcing the issue of slavery onto the national stage.
And Fort Monroe became a haven
Yeah,
for those fleeing slavery.
yeah,
By July 1861, almost 1,000 escaped slaves had arrived, turning the fort into a symbol of hope and resistance.
right.
But this influx of contraband also intensified the debate over emancipation in the North.
Absolutely. You had a variety of different factions within the Union with differing views on how to proceed.
Right.
The abolitionists, for example, were a long-standing group
Yeah.
that had been advocating for immediate and unconditional emancipation.
Right.
They saw the war as an opportunity to finally abolish slavery once and for all.
Then there were the radical Republicans who emerged as a powerful force within the Republican Party.
Right.
They viewed emancipation as a key war tactic to weaken the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And were pushing for more aggressive action against slavery.
Right.
And on the more moderate side, you had the conservative Republicans who favored a more gradual approach,
Yeah.
concerned about the potential political and social upheaval
Of course.
of immediate emancipation.
And of course, there were the Democrats
Right.
who were largely opposed to any interference with slavery
Right.
and often criticized Lincoln's wartime policies.
And it's important to note that even within the Republican Party, there
Yeah.
were divisions
Absolutely.
over the best course of action. And navigating these complexities was Abraham Lincoln,
Right.
a man facing immense pressure from all sides.
It's fascinating to see how Lincoln's stance on emancipation evolved throughout the war.
Yeah,
His primary focus was on preserving the Union,
right.
and he initially believed that directly addressing slavery would further divide the nation.
And that's evident in his response to General Fremont's order in Missouri.
Right.
Fremont, aiming to undermine Confederate sympathizers, declared that any slaves belonging to disloyal owners would be freed.
Right.
Lincoln, fearing a backlash, revoked the order.
Right.
But at the same time, events on the ground were making it increasingly difficult to ignore the issue of slavery.
Right. The growing number of escaped slaves seeking refuge behind Union lines challenged the very foundation of the war effort.
Yeah,
And figures like Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist and former slave,
right.
were tirelessly advocating for emancipation as a moral and military necessity.
Douglass argued that the South's economy and war effort were fundamentally reliant on slave labor. He famously said, "The very stomach of this rebellion is the slave," recognizing that striking at slavery would strike at the heart of the Confederacy.
And Congress also began taking steps to address slavery, albeit cautiously.
Right,
In August of 1861, they passed the first Confiscation Act,
right.
which was significant because it shifted the legal framework surrounding slavery.
I think it's easy to overlook the importance of the Confiscation Acts.
Yeah.
They weren't about outright freeing slaves, but they did allow Union officers to seize slaves if they'd been used to support the Confederate war effort.
Right.
And this was a major step
Yes.
because it recognized slaves as property that could be confiscated,
Right.
undermining the legal basis of slavery itself.
Exactly. It was a strategic move to weaken the enemy by depriving them of resources, including human resources.
Right.
It also signaled that slavery was becoming increasingly entangled with the war's objectives,
Yeah.
setting the stage for more radical measures to come.
And throughout this time, remember, enslaved people were continuing to escape to Union lines.
Right.
In growing numbers.
Right.
They weren't just passive recipients of freedom, they were actively seeking it out.
Absolutely.
And their actions had a direct impact on the war's progression.
They provided valuable intelligence about Confederate movements
Yeah.
and served as laborers for the Union Army, contributing directly to the war effort.
Uh-huh.
Their presence also challenged the moral legitimacy of the Confederacy and fueled the abolitionist movement in the North.
And this brings us to a major turning point in the war. The 7 Days Battles in June 1862.
Right.
This series of brutal clashes resulted in a devastating defeat for the Union,
Yes.
shaking public confidence and forcing a reevaluation of the war's strategy.
The heavy losses suffered during the 7 Days Battles really shifted the perspective of many in the North.
Yeah,
The idea of emancipation, when seen as a radical proposition,
right,
started to gain traction as a necessary measure to achieve victory.
right. Yeah, the Union's setbacks really fueled the debate over the best path to victory,
Yeah.
leading to a clash between Lincoln and his top general, George McClellan.
Right.
McClellan was a staunch Democrat
Yeah.
who was vehemently opposed to emancipation
Yeah.
and believed that the war should focus solely on preserving the Union,
Right.
not interfering with slavery.
This put him in odds with Lincoln, who, after the 7 days, battles became convinced that slavery had to end to truly save the Union.
Right.
He was increasingly influenced by the arguments of abolitionists and radical Republicans,
Yeah.
who saw emancipation as a strategic and moral imperative.
So while McClellan focused on military strategy, Lincoln was grappling with a bigger picture,
Right.
recognizing that the war was fundamentally about the future of freedom and equality in America.
And this clash between Lincoln and McClellan reflects the larger tensions that were dividing the nation at the time.
And Congress, in response to the shifting tide, passed even stronger anti-slavery measures.
Right.
They forbade the return of escaped slaves and outlawed slavery in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
which directly freed around 3,000 people.
These were symbolic victories for the abolitionist movement
Yeah,
and clear indications that the balance was tipping toward emancipation.
right.
But Lincoln knew that he couldn't just abolish slavery outright.
Right.
He needed a plan that wouldn't completely alienate the border states,
Yeah,
which were still part of the Union,
right.
but had strong ties to slavery.
So he attempted a compromise by proposing a plan for gradual compensated emancipation in the border states.
Okay.
The idea was that the government would buy the freedom of enslaved people,
Right.
softening the blow to slave owners and easing the transition to a free society.
It was a pragmatic approach, characteristic of Lincoln's political style.
Yeah,
But the border states were deeply divided on the issue of slavery
right.
and ultimately rejected the proposal.
This was a setback for Lincoln, but it also strengthened his resolve to find a more decisive solution.
Right.
He realized that compromise wasn't going to work when it came to the fundamental question of human freedom. And it's around this time that he began drafting the Emancipation Proclamation.
He knew that issuing such a proclamation would be a radical step one that would redefine the war and have profound consequences for the nation.
All right.
But he was advised to wait for a major Union victory before announcing it. He didn't want it to appear as a desperate act
Right.
from a weakened position.
Yeah.
He needed a win to demonstrate strength and solidify support for such a bold move.
And that win, though, at a terrible cost,
Yeah.
would eventually come at the Battle of Antietam.
Right.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of the carnage at Antietam.
It was the single bloodiest day in American military history,
Yeah.
with nearly 6,000 men killed and another 17,000 wounded.
Wow.
That's more casualties than in the entire Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
The battle raged for hours,
Right.
with intense fighting that transformed the landscape into a scene of unimaginable horror.
The episode describes how one cornfield where a lot of the fighting took place was completely decimated.
Wow.
Every stalk cut down as if by a giant scythe.
Wow.
The ground was littered with bodies, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and death.
And amidst this chaos, you have stories of incredible courage and resilience.
Right.
The episode mentions Clara Barton,
Yeah.
who would later go on to found the American Red Cross.
Right.
She was working as a volunteer nurse and rushed to the front lines, bringing wagon loads of supplies to treat the wounded.
At one point, she was even treating the wounded with corn husks because they'd run out of bandages.
Wow.
Imagine facing that level of suffering
I know.
and still finding the strength to carry on.
It's incredible.
Her story, along with the countless others of those who served as nurses and doctors during the war, speaks volumes about the human capacity for compassion in the face of unimaginable horrors.
Antietam, while technically a draw, was enough of a strategic victory for Lincoln to move forward with his plan.
Right.
Just 5 days after the battle, he gathered his cabinet and announced that he was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation.
Think about the weight of that moment.
I know.
Lincoln standing before his cabinet knowing that he was about to issue a document that would forever change the course of American history.
The preliminary proclamation was issued on September 22, 1862.
Yeah.
And it sent shockwaves through the nation.
Yeah.
It declared that all slaves in Confederate states still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863 would be then thenceforward and forever free.
This wasn't just a political statement.
Right.
It was a seismic shift in the moral and ideological landscape of the war.
Absolutely.
It transformed the conflict from a struggle to preserve the Union into a fight for the freedom and equality of all Americans.
It reframed the very purpose of the war
Yeah.
and had huge implications both domestically and internationally.
In the South, the proclamation was met with outrage.
Of course.
Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, condemned it as an attempt to incite slave rebellions
Right.
and destroy the South's way of life.
Yeah.
But in the North, it was celebrated by abolitionists and many in the Black community,
Yeah.
who saw it as a long overdue step towards justice.
There are also political consequences to consider.
Yeah.
The 1862 midterm elections became a referendum on emancipation,
Right.
with Democrats campaigning against it using fear tactics to stir up racial anxieties
Yeah.
among white voters.
Yeah.
They actually gained seats in Congress,
Wow.
which shows that the nation was still deeply divided on the issue of slavery.
Even within the Republican Party, there were concerns about the potential repercussions of such a radical move.
Right.
Some feared that it would alienate border states and prolong the war.
But Lincoln remained steadfast.
Right.
In December of 1862, he delivered this powerful address to Congress,
Right.
urging them to embrace the great task of ending slavery.
Right.
He argued that emancipation wasn't just about freeing enslaved people, but about strengthening the very foundation of American democracy.
He said, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free."
Wow.
It's a powerful line that speaks to the interconnectedness of freedom and the idea that a nation cannot truly be free while it denies freedom to some of its people.
Absolutely.
And then on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation officially went into effect.
It's crucial to understand that the proclamation wasn't a sweeping immediate liberation
Right.
for all enslaved people.
Right.
It only applied to Confederate states in rebellion,
Yeah.
not to the border states that were still part of the Union.
Right.
And its enforcement depended on the Union Army's ability to actually occupy and control Confederate territory.
Right.
So it was a strategic document as much as a moral one.
Right.
It was designed to weaken the Confederacy by depriving them of their labor force
Yeah.
and to encourage enslaved people to flee to Union lines where they could contribute to the war effort.
But despite its limitations, the Emancipation Proclamation was a monumental turning point in American history.
Absolutely.
It was the first time that the government had officially taken a stance against slavery, declaring it incompatible with the principles of freedom and equality upon which the nation was founded.
And it had a profound impact on the war.
Yeah.
both strategically and morally.
Right.
It provided a legal and ideological basis for the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army.
That's a crucial development
Yeah.
that the episode really highlights.
Yeah.
The proclamation opened up a vital source of manpower for the North,
Right.
while simultaneously weakening the South.
Right.
It allowed black men to fight for their own freedom and the freedom of their families.
The episode specifically mentions the story of a black man working on an abandoned plantation in Mississippi
Yeah.
who is approached by a Union recruiter.
Right.
He's hesitant, at first unsure of what to believe,
Right.
but ultimately decides to join the fight for freedom.
It's a powerful story that captures the complex emotions and calculations that many black men faced at the time.
Absolutely.
The decision to join the Union Army was fraught with risks and uncertainties.
Yeah.
But it also represented a chance to actively participate in shaping their own destiny and the destiny of their people.
And the impact of black soldiers on the war cannot be overstated.
Right.
They fought with incredible bravery and determination,
Yeah.
playing a key role in several major battles.
The episode talks about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment,
Right.
one of the most famous black regiments in the Union Army,
Right.
known for their valor in the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Their story, along with countless others,
Yeah.
demonstrates that black soldiers were not only willing to fight for their freedom, but that they were capable and dedicated soldiers who made significant contributions to the Union victory.
The presence of black soldiers in the Union Army had a profound impact on Confederate morale.
Yeah.
Imagine being a Confederate soldier fighting to preserve slavery and suddenly facing thousands of armed black men determined to win their freedom.
Right.
It must have been a demoralizing experience, to say the least.
And beyond the battlefield, the Emancipation Proclamation had far-reaching implications.
Right.
It effectively ended any chance of foreign intervention in the war on behalf of the Confederacy.
Prior to the proclamation, there was a real possibility that European powers, particularly Great Britain,
Right.
might recognize the Confederacy and provide them with military aid.
The Confederacy was hoping to leverage its cotton production to secure support from European nations who relied on Southern cotton for their textile industries.
Right.
But the Emancipation Proclamation made it politically impossible for Britain to side with a slaveholding nation.
Public opinion in Britain was strongly against slavery.
Yeah.
And supporting the Confederacy would have been a major diplomatic blunder.
Right.
The proclamation solidified the moral high ground for the Union
Right.
and effectively isolated the Confederacy on the international stage.
So the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't just a turning point in the Civil War. It was a watershed moment in American history,
Absolutely.
one that reverberates to this day.
Yeah.
It laid the groundwork for the eventual abolition of slavery
Right.
and set in motion the long and arduous struggle for civil rights and equality that continues to this day.
And it's important to remember that the fight for true equality was far from over even after the war ended.
Right.
Black soldiers, despite their heroic contributions, faced discrimination within the Union Army itself.
Right.
They were often segregated into all-black units,
Right.
given menial tasks instead of combat roles,
Right.
and paid less than their white counterparts.
And if captured by Confederate forces, they faced much harsher treatment, often being returned to slavery or even executed.
It's a stark reminder that even in the midst of a war fought for freedom, prejudice and inequality persisted.
Yeah.
And this is where we really see the lasting impact of this period in American history.
Yeah.
The Emancipation Proclamation was just the beginning of a long and complex journey toward achieving racial justice in America.
Right.
It planted the seeds for a more just and equitable society, but it would take generations of struggle and activism to fully realize those ideals. It really makes you think about the true meaning of freedom.
Yeah.
And the complexities of achieving lasting change.
Right.
The Emancipation Proclamation was a monumental step forward.
Yeah.
But it was just one chapter in the ongoing story of the fight for equality.
And it's a story that's still unfolding today.
Absolutely.
The episode reminds us that the legacy of emancipation is not just about the past.
Right.
It's about the present and the future.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how the echoes of slavery and the struggle for civil rights continue to shape American society.
Right.
This deep dive really brings to light how individual actions, both by those in power and those who were most affected by those decisions, can have a ripple effect across generations.
Think about it. Robert Smalls seizing that ship.
Right.
Those 3 men escaping to Fort Monroe.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass using his voice to demand change.
Yeah.
These weren't just isolated acts of courage.
Right,
They were part of a collective spirit of resistance
right.
that challenged the very foundations of a system built on oppression.
And their actions had a profound impact on the course of history,
Ab-
paving the way for the eventual abolition of slavery
Right.
and inspiring generations of activists
Yeah.
who continued the fight for civil rights.
The episode leaves us with an important question to consider.
Yeah.
Um, Given the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation, what more needed to be done to truly ensure freedom and equality for all Americans after the Civil War?
It's a question that challenges us to look beyond the celebratory narratives
Right.
and grapple with the complexities of achieving lasting change.
Right.
The end of slavery didn't magically erase
No.
centuries of discrimination and inequality.
It took constitutional amendments,
Right.
legislation like the Civil Rights Act,
Yeah.
and generations of tireless activism to even begin to address
Yeah.
the systemic issues rooted in slavery.
And the fight for true equality is far from over.
Absolutely not.
The episode inspires us to consider how we can continue the work that those who came before us so bravely started.
Yeah.
How can we ensure that the promise of freedom and equality is truly realized for everyone?
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in dismantling systems of oppression
Yeah.
and creating a more just and equitable world.
Right.
The fight for freedom is a marathon, not a sprint,
Right.
and it requires constant vigilance
Yeah.
and a commitment to challenging injustice wherever we see it.
This deep dive into emancipation has been a powerful reminder that history is not just something we read about in textbooks.
Right.
It shapes who we are
Yeah.
and the world we live in.
Yeah.
And by understanding the past, we can better navigate the present and work towards a future where the principles of freedom and equality are truly upheld for all.
It really makes you think about the true meaning of freedom and how complex it is to really achieve lasting change.
Yeah.
The Emancipation Proclamation was this huge step forward, but it was only one chapter, in the story of the fight for equality.
Yeah, and a story that's still unfolding today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the episode reminds us that the legacy of emancipation isn't just about the past, it's about now and the future. It's about how the echoes of slavery and the fight for civil rights still shape American society.
Absolutely.
This deep dive really brings to light how individual actions can just ripple out across generations.
Exactly.
Both from those in power and those who are affected by their decisions.
And think about it.
Yeah.
Robert Smalls stealing that ship.
Yeah.
Those 3 men escaping to Fort Monroe.
Right.
Frederick Douglass speaking out, demanding change.
Yeah.
These weren't just random acts of courage.
Yeah.
It was part of this collective spirit of resistance that challenged the system that was built on oppression.
And their actions really impacted the course of history.
Totally.
And paved the way for slavery to be abolished.
All right.
And inspired generations of activists to keep up the fight for civil rights.
The episode leaves us with a big question to think about.
Okay.
Given all the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation, what else had to be done to really make sure everyone was free and equal after the Civil War?
It's a question that makes us think beyond just the celebrations and really dig into how complex it is to achieve lasting change.
Yeah.
Ending slavery didn't just magically wipe away hundreds of years of discrimination
Exactly.
and inequality.
Took amending the Constitution,
Yeah.
passing laws like the Civil Rights Act,
Yeah.
and generations of people fighting tirelessly to even start to address those systemic problems that were rooted in slavery.
And like you said, the fight for true equality is far from over.
Not even close.
The episode really motivates us to think about how we can keep doing the work that those who came before us so bravely started.
Exactly.
How do we make sure that the promise of freedom and equality is actually a reality for everyone?
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in dismantling these systems of oppression.
Yeah.
And making a world that's more just and fair for everyone.
Yeah, the fight for freedom is a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely.
And it takes us constantly being on guard
Right.
and committed to challenging injustice whenever we see it.
That's the key.
This deep dive into emancipation has been really powerful.
It has.
It reminds us that history isn't just something we read about in books.
Right.
It shapes who we are and the world we live in.
Yeah.
And by understanding the past, we can better navigate the present and work towards a future where freedom and equality are real for everyone.
That's it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into emancipation during the Civil War.
It's been a pleasure.